Thank you for tuning in to Koppen with Comic. I'm Brian Koppen. We're with Comic-Kwiatkowski. Kwiatkowski, how the hell are you?
I'm doing all right. I've had a little bit of a day so far. Got a lot of knee pain, and I broke a bunch of glass. So that's cool. That's fun. One that I'm doing.
There's lizards everywhere. Did you broke a lizard's terrarium?
I let all the lizards out. I let them all out as part of my action to free lizards. No, moving my partner's leopard gecko tank. I stumbled on some steps. The whole thing broke. Very messy, very bad. The lizard was not in the tank. That's important.
Wow.
When you're moving them, you don't move them in the tank. You move them in a little safer thing. So I had to go out and get a new tank. I had to clean up a bunch of broken glass. It is what it is. But I have survived with only a few bruises and cuts to my name.
Oh, gosh. Well, I mean, I'm so happy to have you on. Thanks for joining us despite the lizard mayhem. And where can people find you do the online comedy throughout the quarantine? I follow you on Twitter. And it's so funny because although you do come up at Kwiatkowski, your Instagram, which I think is the same thing, teaches me that I can look up -comedy.com and it will come up your Twitter Kwiatkowski. How the hell did that happen?
So I had a website before. It was very outdated, just not really representative of any of the stuff that I got going on. But I'm terrible with web stuff, and so the person who had designed it, built it for me, has sort of gone AFK, just cannot reach them. So I was like, well, I guess I'm just stuck with this old website. But I was like, you know what, maybe it's simple enough to just redirect the domain to the Twitter. So now because the thing is, I'm not a major corporation. I don't know how much I really need a full-on website. I think the Twitter is pretty representative of what I've got going on, videos, comments, stuff like that. All of my scorching hot takes go straight to the Twitter.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just thought it would be easier. So yes, -comedy.com will take you to twitter.com/Kwiatkowski. It's a pretty fancy move on my part, I think.
So it's just a website. Website redirect. And here on your Twitter, I can see that you are a co-host of Psychic Friends with former guest Rosa Escandon. And you're also you're a podcaster for my fourth favorite D&D podcast, Lost in the Multiverse.
That's true. It is everybody's fourth favorite D&D podcast. Someday we'll get on up to third, maybe. That's the dream. The D&D podcast is really fun. We've been running it for a little over a year now. We've had guests like Janet Varney. She's Cora from the Legend of Korra show. We've had Ray Wise, from RoboCop and Twin Peaks and stuff. I taught Ray Wise to play Dungeons and Dragons on the podcast. I'm pretty proud of that one.
You taught RoboCop something?
Not RoboCop. He's the bad guy.
Oh, that's even better. That is even better.
I taught him how to. Yeah, I had him play as an assassin. His first attack, he rolled a crit and did 69 damage. I made a tremendous deal of it.
Yes.
And the rest is, as they say, history. But it's a fun D&D podcast. It's live play, so I DM it. So I've written all the story and I do all the the plot stuff, and then I set this story in front of my players and sort of just see where they go with it.
Wow. And that is not, I mean, it sounds like your guests are big timers and not necessarily comedians.
Well, we do get some comedians too. We've had Marsha Belsky on. We've had I'm trying to think of my less famous guests, which is rude of me. Rosa has been on the podcast.
Well, yeah, there you go. That's all I need. That's the most famous person I care about. But yeah, real quick, we're going to talk about social justice and abolishing the police and things like that. And even in your Twitter bio, I see SJW for Social Justice Warrior. What can you tell us about your hot takes online? your social
Yeah,
justice kind of advocacy and how, any blowback you've experienced from all the Twitterverse.
definitely. It's interesting because I feel like there's this idea that everyone, you have to emerge from, a chrysalis and have perfect opinions and stuff. I think one of the things that really sort of colors my own take on social justice is that, I've been doing stand-up comedy for a decade. And when I started it, if you asked me about free speech and offensive jokes, I would have had opinions that today, current day Dash would have probably been like, hey, that fucking sucks. and
what's one of those takes on free speech back in the day that that you'd be chafing at right now?
I would have been a very, very staunch, like, you can joke about anything as long as it's jokes, it's total, everything's on the table.
Yeah.
And I think part of existing in the year of our Dark Lord 2020 is growth. we have to be comfortable with the idea that we are imperfect currently and we're striving to get better. And I'll have takes, and I think this is part of it too. Some people get this like, oh, I'm scared to say anything, I don't want to get canceled or whatever. I'll reach out to people and just be like, hey, I thought of something. Is this funny or is this messed up? And sometimes people are like, hey, actually, yeah, you haven't considered it from this angle. And I'll say, that's a good point. And, I appreciate the feedback. And I think, there's this idea that people have that the left is just trying to, clamp everything down and shut everyone down. And I don't think that that's true at all. I think that, I think what it means to try to be progressive or try to be, on the side of justice here is to realize that, people got to learn. People have to learn somewhere. And, I'll have people, approach me. I have one person on the internet who messages me every now and then who I've never met. And this is just a person who is aware of me existing. And they'll reach out to be like, hey, I don't get they, them pronouns. Can you explain that to me?
Oh,
and,
cool.
And it's a thing where, it's a person coming at me in good faith, trying to genuinely understand. And, maybe they slip up a little bit. Maybe their language isn't perfect. But at the same time, I know that, like, this person has taken the steps of reaching out and trying to do something and trying to, learn. And I think that's all I'm really looking for, is a genuine attempt at learning, a genuine attempt at figuring stuff out. I think there's this idea that, oh, if you say the wrong thing, people are going to be real mad at you. And some people might, and they have that right because, their lived experience has been wildly frustrating in a number of ways. But I think for the most part, if someone approaches me in good faith and is like, hey, I might goof this up, but I'm genuinely trying to learn.
What's a joke by a famous comedian that Dash Kwiatkowski wouldn't tell, and why wouldn't you tell it? Or just generally, what do you see famous comedians? What do you see famous comedians kind of doing? Like the Dave Chappelle joke about the LGBTQ in the car. Like, did you have a problem with that bit?
Sure. Yeah, I'll say, I think, first of all, I'm not a tremendous fan of Dave Chappelle personally, just because I feel like he's sort of made it very clear that he's no fan of trans people in any number of ways and any number of sort of responses to things. I think the sort of the safest thing is, and you hear a lot of people talk about punching up and punching down, and I think that's sort of how I try to configure the jokes that I'm telling, or at least what I think is funny and how I want to proceed like that. I think a standard example, you hear a lot of, people ragging on Trump, which I think is good because I'm not a big fan of that guy either. But I think, as soon as you're saying, oh, do you see how hard it was for Trump to hold a glass? And, to me, I say, hey, I have people in my life who live with, motor issues or who have trouble holding the glass themselves. I'm not going to try to make fun of Trump for a physical thing when, as far as I know, he can't control that. And it's, to me, there's a lot of worse things, a lot of worse things that guy has done that are much more worthy of mockery. Any number of the things that he said or
done,
just the things that he said and the legislation he's put in, but I think that's a good example where, even someone who is ostensibly on the right side of history can have glaring blind spots in terms of how they handle stuff. And, I think Dave Chappelle's a really interesting example of that, where, when it comes to issues of race, Dave Chappelle is extremely, extremely poignant and has a lot of thoughts that I think, are things that we would certainly agree with on racial injustice, which honestly, with someone like Dave, that makes it a little bit more frustrating when he's got such bad takes on, trans people, because then it's like, hey, you should know better, huh?
Yeah.
Surely you can appreciate the parallels.
And I love your example of Donald Trump, because yes, you're fine with all comedians taking on Donald Trump, but with respect to the whole holding the glass, that would be punching down. And so in the example, like if Dash Kwiatkowski were to do a joke, on the topic or premise of LGBTQ, or anybody who's, on the gender or sexuality spectrum, like what would still be punching down? Like, is there a joke where you could punch down, like, is there a joke that could be appropriate in the same way where Trump jokes are appropriate, except when you're punching down?
Yeah. Actually, I used to have a joke that I would tell, and I said to stop telling this joke, and I'll explain exactly why. But I used to have a joke that I would talk about how, conservatives like to pretend that you can't say anything negative about marginalized people, and that's not true. You can't say the things that they want to say about marginalized people, but perfect example. Caitlyn Jenner is not a good person. We don't really like her on our side of things. Yeah. And if you want to make fun of her for killing someone with her car or any of that stuff, totally fair. That's fair. But we just don't want you to disrespect her identity. And then the joke would further, the second part of the joke, I would talk about how, if you dislike Pol Pot for being a genocidal murderer, totally fair. But if you dislike Pol Pot with, Asian caricatures, stereotypes, then you've done it bad again.
Oh, I love that.
And I would talk about this, and this is an example that I go to a lot, because I would tell this joke in clubs in the middle of the country, and I would see audiences, mostly white audiences, and I would see them laughing specifically when I talk about like the Asian stereotype part. And I'm watching someone and thinking, oh, you don't actually understand what part of the joke that I wrote. You know what I mean? I'm watching these people being like, oh, you think that I'm making fun, and I'm Asian American, so I felt comfortable using that as an example. But at the same time, it's not free reign for the person receiving the joke. And that's a joke that I had to stop telling, because I was like, people aren't taking it the right way, and as clever as I might think it is, it's being misinterpreted in a way that I think is not helpful, and is sort of fueling a thing that I'm not trying to be a part of.
So yeah, you could tell it in New York City if those audiences are presumably laughing at the correct part.
It's a little harder, although that sort of gets into a whole other thing where people talk about the coasts versus the middle of the country versus the South, and you'll get a lot, and this sort of goes to punching down again, right? Because as someone spent 10 years driving up and all over this bad country, and I will say this: the coasts are not less racist than the middle of the country or the South. I'll say it's racist in a different way. I feel a little bit safer existing on a coast. I feel, I don't feel threatened walking around, with a rainbow flag or with a trans pride flag. I feel a lot safer doing that, on the West Coast, on the East Coast. Yeah. But I'd say it's, just as racist, just as sort of homophobic in different ways. And, again, safer, maybe less threatening ways, but still racist and sexist. And I think that's really important, because you get a lot of people, and this sort of fuels the sort of the coastal elite myth, right? But a lot of people, when they're making fun of the South, a lot of people are actually just making fun of poverty. And I think, that doesn't really help anybody, or and it's sort of, I feel like, a little bit hypocritical.
And what kind of, you said there's still some homophobia in New York City, like a different type, what can you mention? What kind of, racism and sexism and homophobia is happening in New York City still?
I'll say this: that my first my first, I think, 2 weeks of being in New York, I moved here for stand-up. My first 2 weeks of being in New York, I got booked on a show. I went out to that show, and I watched a comic before me who is beloved, who's liked a lot by, leftist comics, who's liked a lot, who is ostensibly, in air quotes on the right side of history. I watched the comic get up and do a joke that compared gay marriage and civil rights to bestiality. And, the joke got laughs and people laughed, and a lot of people would listen to someone like this make a joke like this and say, oh, well, he's not hateful. There's no hate there. But, as if you look into the sort of the history of it, you look at that sort of that metaphor comparing, oh, well, if two guys can get married, why not, a guy and a dog, why not whatever? And that's a dog whistle that we've been hearing for years, that has been used to discredit queer civil rights for a really long time. And so to hear someone very comfortable make a joke like that, and obviously it wasn't, and this isn't to say like, and that was the one homophobic joke I've ever heard in New York City, you know what I mean? Like it's pretty common. And I think this sort of goes to the thing we were saying before about, free speech and what does it mean to make jokes. And I think there's something, I'm not ever going to tell someone what jokes they are allowed to make, because I don't believe that I have that right, and I don't think that anybody has that right. But I think that if you're going to get up on stage with a microphone and be likable and make people laugh, and to claim that your job is to sort of bring joy, right? Because I think ultimately that's what stand-up is about. You're trying to make people laugh. You're trying to bring some sort of comfort and entertainment. And if you can make them think about something, that's good too. And I think that's a noble effort. But I think, it's not about what people are allowed to say, but I do think there is a responsibility that goes into it. If you're the type of person who is holding a microphone and talking to a crowd, there's a responsibility to think about the things that you are putting into the world. And are you helping or are you hurting? And even if you're hurting in a way that's subtle, or you think it's all right because it's funny, like, that's a decision that I think everyone should spend a little bit of time thinking about before they make it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And the one person that's thinking about it is Dash Kwiatkowski. And Dash, the easiest way for people to find your comedy is dashcomedy.com. And I thank you so much, Dash Kwiatkowski, for coming on.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It's great talking to you.